Hey everyone. Today I want to talk about something that's not just geopolitical, but actually deeply human. A shift that's been unfolding quietly but firmly, something that if you zoom out from headlines and politics, you'll see is far more than just global diplomacy or power games. It's about evolution, about a civilization reclaiming its trajectory. Now, let's be clear, this isn't an anti-West statement. It's not about blame, it's about balance. It's about a country, with one of the oldest continuous civilizations on the planet, moving into a position where it's no longer being steered. It's steering itself. You know, if you zoom out far enough, like not 10 years, not 50, but maybe 200, 300 years, you start to see patterns that aren't visible on the surface. One of those patterns is how nations rise and fall, and how influence shifts. It's like a pendulum, sometimes slow, sometimes sudden, but it always swings. Now, India's story is one of the most fascinating in human history. We're talking about a civilization that dates back thousands of years before the Roman Empire, before most of Europe had written alphabets. It invented the concept of zero, advanced astronomy, surgery, mathematics, you name it. And then, somewhere around the 18th century, the trajectory changed. Colonization happened. The British Empire took over, and this massive, innovative civilization was essentially put into standby mode. Colonialism wasn't just about taking resources, it was about rewriting a nation's mental software. It replaced systems, languages, education, even self-belief. It taught generations of Indians that value comes from somewhere else, from London, Paris, Washington. That pattern, this idea of external validation, didn't just vanish after 1947 when India became independent. It stuck around. You could say it's like legacy code. Even after you uninstall the old program, some bugs still linger in the background. So what happened post-independence? Well, India was free politically, but still very much entangled in Western frameworks, whether it was trade via the US dollar, economic policies modeled after World Bank or IMF suggestions, or education systems heavily inspired by Oxbridge and the West. And look, this wasn't always bad. It helped India integrate into the global system. But integration is not the same as leadership. Integration can still mean dependency. That sips the chain I found talking about. The West didn't control India in the conventional sense anymore, but it still held onto the levers, credit ratings, tech patents, media narratives, and even talent migration. For decades, many of India's brightest minds left for MIT, Stanford, or Wall Street because the perception was that real opportunity lay out there, not at home. But here's the interesting thing. India didn't fight this system directly. It learned from it. It reverse-engineered the operating system. It built parallel systems, quietly, iteratively, incrementally. And now it's starting to push those systems into the global arena, from UPI and Adhar to space missions and diplomatic independence. It's like watching open-source beat proprietary software. What makes this moment historic is that India isn't trying to catch up anymore. It's moving on a different vector. It's no longer seeking to be accepted by the West. It's creating its own value, its own identity, and offering it to the world. And that's what I mean when I say the final chain, mental, systemic, and structural, is breaking. Once a nation knows how to code its own future, it doesn't need anyone else's permission to build it. So, let's talk about technology, because honestly, this is where the real game is being played. Military strength? Sure. Diplomacy? Important. But tech is the invisible infrastructure of power. It's what silently runs economies, controls information, enables surveillance, shapes culture, and the countries that don't control their tech stack, they don't control their future. For a long time, like several decades, the Western world, mainly the US, pretty much owned this domain. From microchips and operating systems to payment systems and AI platforms, if you wanted to build or scale anything significant, you had to plug into a Western system. There wasn't really an alternative. Now let's look at India. For a long time, it was a net tech consumer. Great engineers, amazing talent, but most of it was being exported. Silicon Valley was full of Indian brains building Western fortunes. The infrastructure back home, still dependent. From mobile operating systems to GPS, from banking infrastructure to payment networks, it was Western dominated. But over the last 10, 15 years, something shifted. And it wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, it was subtle, systemic, and honestly, very smart. India started building its own digital architecture, not because it was trying to be protectionist, but because it saw the risk in overdependence. UPI, for example. It's not just a payment system. It's a digital backbone. It made sending money across India as easy as sending a text message. No transaction fees, no foreign intermediaries. That's independence. That's what breaking chains looks like. Then there's Aadhaar, over 1 billion people with a biometric digital ID integrated into banking, welfare, taxation, again built locally, and incredibly hard to replicate at that scale. And now look at semiconductors. India is investing billions in chip fabrication plants, partnering with countries like Japan and Israel, because it knows you can't be a 21st century superpower if your chips are made somewhere else. Even in space, India is taking a bold approach. I mean, you've got ISRO landing a rover near the moon's south pole at a fraction of what it costs NASA. That's not just impressive, it's disruptive. And you know what's most interesting? The West is now studying these models. That's when you know the game has flipped, when the old teacher starts taking notes from the student. What India is doing isn't set about isolation. It's set about autonomy. It's set saying, we set still partner, we set collaborate, but we set not dependent anymore. That SIP's a really important distinction. Because in today's world, power isn't about how many fighter jets you have. It's about how many patents you control, how much of your infrastructure runs on your own terms, how much of your population is connected not just physically, but digitally, securely, and sovereignly. India has understood that. It SIP's building for it. And that's why I say, the game isn't about headlines, it's about the architecture underneath them. And India? It's been quietly rewriting its blueprint. Now let us talk diplomacy. Because if you want to understand where global power is shifting, you have to stop looking at just economics or tech. You have to look at how a nation positions itself in the world, who it aligns with, who it challenges, and more importantly, how it makes decisions when it's being pulled from both sides. India is in a unique spot right now. It's not part of any fixed bloc, it's not fully aligned with the West, nor is it leaning completely east. It's what I call non-alignment 2.0. And that SIP's actually a pretty brilliant strategy. Let me explain. Historically, during the Cold War, the non-alignment movement meant trying to stay neutral between the US and the Soviet Union. But today's world isn't bipolar anymore. It's multipolar. And that makes non-alignment more like strategic flexibility, agile, dynamic, opportunity-focused. India, for instance, is part of the BRICS alliance with China and Russia, clearly counter-Western in many ways. But at the same time, it's a key player in the Quad, alongside the US, Japan, and Australia, aimed at Indo-Pacific security. So you've got India sitting at two different tables, and it's not getting torn apart, it's shaping the menu. When the US and its allies sanctioned Russian oil, India didn't fall in line. It kept buying, because it served its energy security. It didn't apologize. It didn't grandstand. It just made the decision based on its national interest. That SIP's the key point. India is playing by its logic, not someone else's framework. Now, some traditional powers might interpret this as being difficult or unpredictable. But I actually think it's very rational. It's engineering-level thinking applied to geopolitics. What's the objective function? Security, growth, sovereignty. What are the constraints? Global pressure, regional threats, resource limits. What's the solution space? Fluid diplomacy, self-defined priorities, parallel alliances. You see, the world is moving toward a decentralized model, whether in finance, information, or influence. And India is building its foreign policy the same way. And this isn't anti-West. India still trades heavily with the US, works closely with Israel on defense, and partners with European nations on sustainability and tech. It just refuses to be told what to do. And that SIP's the chain that SIP's quietly snapping. For decades, diplomacy was about alignment. Pick your side, stick to the narrative. But now, the smartest nations are building multi-aligned architectures, like a distributed system. If one node fails, the network still runs. That's SEP's what India SEP's doing. It's building redundancy into its foreign relations. And in a future full of shocks, economic, military, environmental, that resilience could make all the difference. So yeah, non-alignment 2.0, it's not about standing still, it's about moving in every direction you need, at the speed that makes sense, without waiting for permission. And that SIPS is real control. So, let's talk about something that most people don't see, but that's literally shaping the entire future of civilization: data. In the 20th century, Power came from controlling oil. In the 21st century, it comes from controlling data, and just like oil, if you don't control your own supply, you end up paying a premium for access, for influence, for survival. Now here's the problem most countries face, especially developing ones. Their data flows out. It's harvested by foreign apps, stored on foreign servers, and analyzed by foreign algorithms, which means decisions about their people are being made somewhere else. But India is doing something different. India is actively building data sovereignty. It's one of the only major countries that's really thinking about this like an engineer would, like a systems problem that needs a secure, scalable architecture. And that starts with infrastructure. India passed data localization laws. Basically, it told global tech companies, if you collect Indian data, it stays in India. It's not negotiable. That's a big move, because most of the cloud infrastructure is still controlled by the US, Amazon, Google, Microsoft. But India didn't just make a demand, it built the capacity to back it up. And it's going further. UPI, the digital payment platform, is not just a convenience tool, it's a public utility. The government owns the pipes, and it's not just domestic. Countries like France, Singapore, and UAE are now integrating with it. That means Indian digital systems are going global without being dependent on Visa or MasterCard. And then there's Aadhaar, the digital ID platform. Over 1 billion people onboarded, linked to everything from banking to healthcare. But again, it's not privatized, it's sovereign, it's Indian data for Indian systems. And now comes the next layer, AI. Most large language models, the ones driving the current AI revolution, are trained on Western data, Western values, Western languages, but India is now training its own models in Hindi, Tamil, Bengali, and dozens of local languages. Why? Because language isn't just communication, it's cognition. If your AI doesn't understand your culture, it won't serve your people. India is also exploring quantum computing, blockchain for governance, and indigenous 5G stacks. That's not just innovation, it's insulation. It's risk mitigation in a volatile digital future. Because here's the hard truth. In the next 10 years, countries won't be conquered by armies. They'll be manipulated through algorithms, their elections, their markets, their minds. And the only defense? Digital self-reliance. India sees that, and it sits acting on it. Most countries are still thinking in analog terms. Borders, bases, tariffs. India is securing its digital borders. And it's quietly building the equivalent of a digital Iron Dome, layered, sovereign, intelligent. So when we say India broke the final chain, this is one of the biggest pieces. Because the final chain isn't just about politics or trade, it's about who owns the data that defines you. India is saying, we it'll own ours. So we've talked about technology, diplomacy, infrastructure, and data. But let's zoom in on something more subtle, something more powerful than economics or policy. The final chain is psychological. Now, this is not something people usually talk about in the context of geopolitics, but honestly, it's the most important layer. Because if you control how people think, you don't need to control anything else. You've already won. Let's look at India's case. For a long time, decades, maybe even centuries, the idea was that progress meant becoming more like the West. If you spoke English well, studied in London or Boston, wore a suit, and quoted Western authors, you were modern. That was the image. Subtle, but very real. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with learning from the West. The West has created a lot of great things. Science, institutions, innovation. But the problem happens when a country starts to believe that its own systems, traditions, and ideas are somehow inferior by default. That sips the mental chain. And it runs deep. It affects how people see themselves. It affects what young people aspire to be. For decades, the dream for millions of Indians was to leave, go abroad, get a job in Silicon Valley, or London, or maybe Australia. That was the symbol of success. But something's shifting now. More Indian students are choosing to build careers at home. More Indian startups are going global from India, not by leaving India. More creators, scientists, and entrepreneurs are saying, we don't need to imitate, we can innovate. And that sips, not nationalism. That sips self-belief. When ISRO landed Chandrayaan near the lunar South Pole, on a budget smaller than some Hollywood movies, that wasn't just a technological success. It was a psychological milestone. It told 1 billion people, we can do this. on our terms. That belief, once internalized, is unstoppable. Because what holds countries back isn't always money, or military, or even tech. It's self-doubt. It's the lingering feeling that greatness belongs elsewhere. When that flips, when a nation starts believing it is the source of innovation, that it deserves to lead, that its values, culture, and models are worth exporting, that's when transformation becomes permanent. It's like switching operating systems from reactive to proactive. India is going through that shift right now. Quietly, no slogans, no drama, just evolution. And the world is noticing. You can see it in how international investors now see India as a creator market, not just a consumer market. You can see it in how global universities are partnering with Indian institutions, not just recruiting from them. You can see it in how Indian-made solutions, like UPI, are being adopted internationally. That tips what breaking the final chain looks like. Is this not loud? Is this not explosive? Is this internal? But once it happens, there's thus no going back. India no longer needs validation. It needs vision. And from what I'm seeing, that vision is already being built. Now let's zoom out. Because when we talk about India breaking the final chain of Western control, it's easy for people to assume that means rivalry, some kind of East versus West competition, but that's not the most productive way to look at it. What's actually happening here isn't a confrontation. It's a reset. We're transitioning from a unipolar world, dominated by Western institutions, currencies, and narratives, to a multipolar one. A world where power isn't centralized in one geography, but distributed across different ecosystems. And I think that SIP's a good thing. It's more stable, it's more innovative, it's less fragile. Because think about it, when everything is dependent on one system, one model, one supply chain, that's inherently risky. It's like having a single server run an entire global network. If that node fails, economically, politically, or ethically, the whole system suffers. India emerging as a sovereign power in tech, diplomacy and development adds redundancy to the global framework, and if you're building any large-scale system, like a rocket or an AI neural net, you always build redundancy. That's how systems become resilient. And India's rise isn't happening through war or coercion. It's happening through scale, strategy, and design. That's very different from previous superpower models. Instead of exporting ideology, India is exporting infrastructure, digital public goods, healthcare models, and financial systems that are open source, decentralized, and adaptable. That's not just soft power, that's systems power. And here's the other thing. It doesn't mean the West loses. That's the zero-sum fallacy. The US doesn't need to fall for India to rise. Europe doesn't need to weaken for Asia to innovate. In fact, when new innovation hubs emerge, it forces everyone to level up. It raises the global baseline. It's like having more teams in a space race. You get better rockets, faster iteration, greater learning. So this is not about replacing the West, it's about balancing it. And honestly, that balance is overdue. For too long, global narratives have come from one direction, one style of thinking, one history, one worldview that creates blind spots. It excludes billions of voices, and it creates friction. India brings a different lens, shaped by diversity, by scale, by philosophical traditions that go back thousands of years. That perspective matters, especially in a world dealing with complex, multidimensional challenges like AI ethics, climate collapse, inequality, and post-capitalist economies. So, if we're building the next civilization layer, whether it's multiplanetary life, a global digital society, or a sustainable future, it can't be built by one cultural codebase alone. You need multiple contributors, like open source. And India? It just committed its code. Not to dominate the system, but to expand it, to make it richer, more robust, and honestly, more human. That SEP's not a rivalry. That SEP's progress. So, why does any of this matter? Why talk about India breaking the final chain of Western control? Why explore diplomacy, tech sovereignty, psychological shifts, data architecture? It matters because what we're witnessing isn't just a national pivot, it's a civilizational adjustment. And these dynamics happen often. Every few hundred years, the center of gravity shifts, not just economically, but intellectually and spiritually. And that shift determines how the next phase of human history unfolds, who tells the story, who builds the tools, who sets the default assumptions about what's normal and what's possible. India stepping into this role means the future won't be shaped by a single perspective. It won't be a Western operating system with local language support. It'll be a multi-source firmware update for the human experience. And that SIP's really important, especially now, because we're at an inflection point as a species. Climate change, AI alignment, post-scarcity economics, synthetic biology, multiplanetary life. These aren't local problems, they're planetary systems problems. You can't solve them with one model. You need diverse inputs, diverse logic, diverse imaginations. India brings a new imagination, one that's born from scale, from complexity, from spiritual infrastructure, and computational thinking blended together. This isn't about nationalism, or pride, or competition. It's about what kind of operating system we want for the future of Earth. Do we want a future where a handful of institutions decide what's true, where the entire digital economy flows through a few mega servers in one region? Or do we want a future that's modular, resilient, culturally intelligent, and deeply local, yet globally synced? India breaking its last chain means it's no longer asking to be included in the conversation. It's starting its own. It's designing its own stack, social, digital, economic, and inviting others to contribute, not just consume. And honestly, I think that's the future we need. A world where innovation isn't just outsourced, but distributed, where solutions come from the ground up, where no one region has a monopoly on truth or value or vision. If we start serious about building a future worth getting excited about, we need more sovereign thinkers, more regions, thinking like engineers, not just diplomats, more civil